Well, welcome to Life and Faith. This is Justine Toe from the Centre for Public Christianity. Well, I wonder if you've ever done the travel thing, especially in your 20s. It's something of an established rite of passage for many Australians, and I think many Australians all agree that we love travel. But today in the West, many of us can also spend our entire lives on the road, searching for the next big thing, moving from one experience to the next, and always wanting to be on the move. Now, for Mark Sayers, this is the culture of the road, and it can make us restless. And this is the idea that he explores in his new book, The Road Trip That Changed the World. And I'm delighted that you're here, Mark, so that you can tell us about your book.
Thanks for having me.
Now, when you talk about the restlessness and constant dissatisfaction in relation to being on the road, what do you mean by that?
I think our community absolutely enshrines the idea of personal freedom, yet there's also a desire for community and rootedness and so on. So the tension between those two things creates in the sort of contemporary person this dissatisfaction that constantly sort of motivates us to try to find new ways to sort of fill that void.
Your book actually has an extended conversation with the work of Jack Kerouac, and particularly his seminal novel On the Road. And you also argue that On the Road was so influential that it's actually shaped our idea of the road trip ever since. Now, why do you think Kerouac's work made such an impact?
Well, sort of after World War II, you had Europe was almost sort of had reached this nihilistic point, had been bombed to smithereens. Philosophically, it sort of come to existentialism. And then, in the sort of wake of that, America takes off with this massive economic boom. And what Kerouac does, he sort of rebels against that. He's trying to look for the sort of spiritual side that, is not sort of met by the white picket fence and the TV and the refrigerator. But what he does is he sort of articulates this sort of release valve in the sort of Western consumer dream where we go to find meaning. So instead of it being religion, even though Kerouac was quite religious, he sort of advocates this experiential, moving sort of way to find meaning.
And what I find one of the most interesting insights of your book, of many, is that you say that what was really countercultural in Kerouac's time, this idea of, leaving home to go on the road and finding experience and pleasure, you said that it's actually become the mainstream now. This is what a lot of young adults and a lot of not only just young adults do today.
Well, I mean, when I first read On the Road, it just wasn't that amazing to me. It seems so cliche. It was like my friend's life. A bunch of young adults driving in a car, having fun, going on this road trip, sleeping around, taking drugs, looking for experiences. That's become the sort of dominant framework that people live out today. It's almost a rite of passage. But when Kerouac wrote it, it was deeply, deeply shocking. And whilst On the Road wasn't banned, some of his other friends who were explaining, what was happening with his group of friends' lives, their books were banned because it was so seen as subversive at the time.
Yeah, and you do make the point that in some ways Kerouac's book preempts the 60s. It just tells us where we're going to go. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, well, in the Dharma Bums, which is another one of his books, he advocates for this rucksack revolution, this way of sort of fighting against this consumer, what he saw as sort of secular flatness in American life. So all these young people to go on the road, which then inspires people in the 60s. Interestingly, Kerouac then hated the results of that and sort of actually became more conservative as he got older. But in many ways, he kicks off that dream.
Yeah, we'll come back to this idea of how he was disillusioned by the end of his time on the road. But I want to talk about the cultural idea of home. You say that we used to value home, the idea of being rooted in one place and having your identity and your purpose shaped by your surrounding context. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Dale Keene's work, but he calls that the T world, the world of tradition, of tribe, of authority, etc. But now, as you say, we view life as a journey, right, instead. Now, why have we left home behind?
Well, I think, again, too, that T world restricts, by being part of a tribe, being part of tradition, our individual autonomy has to be restricted somewhat. There's a trade-off there. And I think what's happened, particularly in Australia, is we've flipped from home to house. We're utterly obsessed with house. We're utterly obsessed with interior decorating, backyards, all of that jazz. But it's a completely different idea to home. So we repurpose life in our minds as this journey where the individual's on this sort of little path where everything revolves around the individual sort of journey. And journey becomes almost this sort of secular way of viewing life, giving it some sort of layers of meaning.
You're listening to Life and Faith from the Centre for Public Christianity.
From what you were saying before, that we want to have our cake and eat it too. We want the freedom, but we also want a sense of rootedness as well. And yet, at the same time, we are dissatisfied with any attempts of T world thinking to try and bring us back to that sort of way of life. So we want to just go out on the road and do our own thing. Is that basically where we are?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what we're trying to get T-World. We'll try and get things in our home which almost look like, they're linked to tradition. People like to take sort of traditional artifacts and so on. We like to have furniture which seems to tell a story by being sort of old and worn. But it still doesn't give us that which the T-World as it's described really can give us, which is that sense of meaning, which only comes from limiting our autonomy.
I will say, though, that Dalkeen spends quite a bit of time talking about how the T-world has a lot to answer for as well. Like, it also oppressed a lot of people. If you were a woman, if you were a minority, if you were gay, it wasn't like all that fun for you as well. Can you understand why people would want to leave home or leave the T-world behind them?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think that there has to be a set of rules then to define, in a sense, that T-world. I wouldn't say that it's, there's, I think, a panoply of different T-world options around the world. Some obviously have had sort of more stringent rules than others, but I still think that, deeply embedded within humans is that desire for connection, and the person who's an absolute autonomous individual, I think, will always struggle with that lack of meaning in their life.
So now we've moved out of home, so to speak, because we want to leave that behind us. So we've gone on the road, but, and this kind of ties in with what we were saying before, we're not exactly finding freedom either. You've actually written in the book, in a culture that offers no greater narrative than the road, unlimited freedom and choice can be terrifying. And some people have actually said that an excess of choice actually makes it harder to choose. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, Barney Schwartz, who has written about this as a psychologist, talks about the levels of anxiety that come over us just going to a supermarket and looking at the range of different washing powder, from the expensive one to the sensitive skin one to the environmental one, and just the sort of physiological stress that puts on our body. But when you're dealing with the big existential questions as well, if you look at any sort of sitcom now, if you even look at shows like Can of Worms, they're all about, we're stressed now by these choices in front of us, and we've got no singular vision, helping us make those correct choices.
Sorry, I just want to clarify. You mean Barry Schwartz, right? Because Barney Schwartz is a journalist, I think.
In Melbourne, I always get them wrong.
Yeah. I find his work quite interesting as well. He says that if we're so overwhelmed by choice that firstly it's difficult to choose, but secondly that we also feel dissatisfied with whatever choice we end up going with, because we're always haunted by this possibility that we might have been happier if we chose something else.
Yeah, and it's almost then you come to this almost sociological parallel universes. So even if you make that decision, you've made all these, what you think you've got the right house, right spouse, there's always that, what if scenario that it could be another parallel universe where I would be happier. So that undermines the happiness that you actually have. It
also reminds me, I went to a conference a couple of years ago, and Steve Biddulph was there, who's this parenting expert, and he referred to this book called The Sibling Society, and in that book, the author makes the argument that these days no one wants to be the adult, no one wants to be in charge in a way. We all want to just kind of do our own thing. And it did strike me that in the book, you've written that, we like this idea of the road because it enables us to remain emotionally adolescent. So why does the culture of the road prevent us from growing up?
Yeah, and I think there's two ways of looking at it. This is the place that we're philosophically arrived at this point in history. But also, too, the Western consumer world is heavily invested in keeping us as adolescents. Someone who is mature and wise will make far more prudent decisions about their finances. An adolescent who is controlled by feelings, who only thinks in the moment, is going to spend a lot more money on stupid stuff that they don't need. So also, we're heavily invested. There's a Commonwealth Bank ad not so long ago encouraging baby boomers to spend their kids' inheritance. So there's a huge economic investment in the West to keep us adolescent as well.
Yeah, and this is the kind of crazy thing, right? Because in the end, it's not just individuals making these choices. It's like these choices are actually out of our hands. They're shaped by, economic imperatives to actually keep us spending money as well.
Absolutely, and even I'd say even the political system in the West is now come around. The politician who wins is going to give us the maximum choice, keep our options open, and freedom. Now, when politicians talk about it, it's a very different concept to what spoke about, I guess, at the beginnings of liberalism and so on.
And can you give us an insight into that sort of distinction? Like, how was liberalism Sorry, if you could summarise all that philosophical thought in a soundbite.
Yeah. Well, if you look at the 19th century was a century of revolution. It was a century of people, in some sense, referring back to what we were talking before with T-World, of fighting against that stuff. Go from the French Revolution onwards. But where we are today, it's at this point of more keeping the individual's options open. It's almost those two ideas of sort of freedom that I think Isaiah Berlin talked about. That idea of negative freedom that, we almost can't believe in anything big, and that gives us a sense to sort of then have this freedom where we're not going to fight and kill each other over those sort of big things, utopian dreams.
The Centre for Public Christianity, Beyond Religion.
There seems to be a lot of crossover between what you're talking about and postmodernism. Sorry to use that ism sort of word. And what I mean by that is that it's like we've given up on these big stories of meaning and purpose, the kind of stuff that you said that we would kill each other over. And because we've given up those big stories, all that's left is for the individual to make their own story, to carve out their own life story rather than commit to something bigger than the self. Now, there's great freedom in that because, apparently there's no one way to live, but what are its costs?
Well, I think, once more what we've done is we've gone from the philosophical sort of postmodernism of the 1980s and so on to now we have this very practical lived postmodernism, which is now fully influencing us. So, no longer is truth given to us by sort of authority figures. We now
God or the church or
even politicians, bankers. We don't trust any of them anymore, the military. So we now have the sort of dominant philosophical framework you'll see on TV is what Adam Curtis calls the circle of friends. It's the 7 p.m. project. It's the sitcom where we now get that sort of sense of truth and experience through our friends. We now are focused on the 3 Fs, which is friends, family, and fun. So we have this sort of shrunken meta-narrative. So we don't want to live without any meta-narrative or big story influencing us. So we create this tiny little one that's like a little, life vest to be on the sea. But again, too, when big life issues come up, when aging, when death, when economic crises come up, we have the little sort of happy world that we create is not actually going to help us with any of those things.
Now, you speak to a lot of young people in the course of your work, and I'm wondering, do you sense this sort of push and pull in them? On the one hand, they're yearning for something bigger than themselves. They want something to give their lives to. But on the other hand, they want all the pleasures and freedoms and to do whatever they want without being responsible to, something bigger than themselves as well. Do you get that contradiction?
Well, I mean, almost what I've done with this book too is I've relabeled young to almost say anyone born post-1947. I think anyone born post-1947 who's part of the baby boomers, then Gen X, then Gen Y, then whatever comes next, thinks in this sort of youth mentality. I wouldn't want to put money on it, but I am speculating that there is an increased frustration with that, particularly with a younger age group who now have no role models to look at. Their grandparents are acting irresponsibly.
Well, this is the whole sibling society that this guy's talking about.
Robert Bly, yeah. It's interesting too, like if you look, eventually I think that there's a point where this has to sort of run its course a little bit. I think, if you look over, what we've seen in the Middle East and so on, there is a desire, and even within different ethnic communities, you've got a rub in the West between ethnic communities have a very sense of, a bigger meta-narrative, what that means, and how that sort of rubs up against this sort of, what is seen as a meaningless world.
And so what do you think is the solution? I mean, you've said that you think that it has sort of run its course, or people are waking up to the problem that we're in. So what might be the solution to our restlessness as well as much as anything else? Yeah,
for me, as someone who writes about this stuff, but also as a Christian, minister, for me this comes back to, ultimately it's a religious question. I think the West has attempted to, explore these ideas of, personal freedom and so on, but also do that without the meta-narrative of religion, which actually helped us get to this point. So for me, ultimately, a number of these, sociological questions will always take us back to a theological answer.
I've often been struck by the fact that in the West we tend to think about freedom in negative terms. This sense of, freedom from other people, freedom from others so that I can do my own thing.
And I think that what we've jettisoned is something which is strongly a part of the Western tradition, which, for me, Christianity brings in, which is actually that we need freedom from ourselves. And the actual point between the tea world and the oppression that brought through, patriarchy or oppression or whatever, and then the sort of unlimited autonomy that we have now is actually that idea of actually, what if it's actually dying to self? And the sort of Christian image of a God who actually comes and then gives up his freedom so that we may have freedom is, for me, an incredibly ripe and unexplored area that I think is worth looking at again.
And you'll find all this good stuff to explore in Mark Sayer's new book, The Road Trip That Changed the World. Thank you, Mark.
My pleasure.